Hello, good evening, and good day, everybody. Welcome to the 93rd live episode of the Ask Abhijit show. I hope you're doing well, all of you. And let me see who all is there. Let me greet all of you. I can see Umbrella Corporation, Super Duper, Abir, Megdeep, Divyang, Prachit, Gala Emperor, Saucy, Praful, DK Boss, Dungar Singh Chauhan, Arya, Music and Education, Siddhant, Komal, Amit, Oldie 98 years, Sakshat, Aryan, Chiching, Akash, Rathor, Macper, Daniel D'Souza, Sarthak, Anthony Mack, Omkar, Greater India, Vijay Vaghela, Ramit Thakur, Killer Joker, Trupti Patil, Prachit, Lovedeep, Shivaji Raje, Deepak Sai, and lots of other people. Good evening, good day to all of you. It is great to be back amongst you all. So let's get right into it. There are a great number of questions that you all have asked. I've picked up a bunch of those, and let's get into the questions right away. So this is by Ishan. And Ishan says, why is the West so afraid of Mr. Putin? Is it primarily because he has access to the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, or are there more reasons to it? Well, Mr. Putin represents a different kind of he of course is a threat to the West. Like you said, he owns the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The Russian nuclear arsenal is larger than that of the US, and they have the technology to back it up. They have the delivery systems to back it up. They have ICBMs, they have nuclear submarines, and they have all kinds of other delivery mechanisms. So that is one reason for that. The other thing is that Russia controls a very large land mass across Eurasia. They have access to so many resources. Even if you put sanctions on them, they will be able to remain self-sufficient. They are a very powerful nation, and if they ally with China, then they can set up a separate parallel system, global system. They could try to do that, and that represents a threat to essentially what is American hegemony. So, for the longest time after 1991, you had a unipolar world. There was only one superpower, the US. We still have only one superpower, but we have a rising power, which is China, which has a very significantly large economy, more than 14 15 trillion dollars worth today. And if they tie up with Russia, then it represents a significant threat to US hegemony over the world. So that's one of the reasons why the Americans see, when we talk about the West, we're talking about the US. Because the major power, the dominant power, the hegemonic power in the West is nothing but the US. Even in Europe, the dominant power is the US, in Western Europe. So when we talk about the West, we're talking about the United States. So that's the reason why they are, you could say that they are afraid of Mr. Putin, not because he is all powerful today, but because he could become, or Russia could become, under his guidance, under his direction, a more dangerous and a more powerful nation in the future. And the US doctrine has always been to never allow another large power to rise. They have made a mistake when it comes to China, and they don't want to repeat the mistake when it comes to Russia. So even when Mr. Putin 20 or so years ago, when he expressed a desire to join NATO, so he was rebuffed, and they did not allow Russia to join NATO, which would have brought Russia into the US orbit. So they did not allow that, and they kept expanding NATO eastward in breach of the guarantee they had given. And that's how it is. So they see the Russians as a long-term threat, especially when it comes to a possible alliance with China. And that's why we are seeing all the geopolitical action that we are seeing today. So that's the reason why. Shankajit says, why didn't Russia use its best fighter jets, drones, or state of the art technology like S-400 or 500 in Ukraine, but allowed the Ukrainians to shoot down a number of its warplanes, helicopters, tanks, and kill so many soldiers? Is the Russian military as powerful as we think it to be? Okay, so first of all, you're saying that the Ukrainians have shot down a large number of warplanes and helicopters. They've destroyed lots of tanks and killed so many soldiers. So on what basis have you reached this conclusion that so many casualties have happened among Russia's soldiers, and so many tanks, planes, etc. have been destroyed? From where did you obtain this data? Is it the propaganda you have been seeing on Twitter, on the Western media, on YouTube, and on various Indian news channels? There are a couple of, at least two, three news channels in India which are reporting from Ukraine. They are embedded within the Ukrainian forces, more or less, and they are uh, the news that they are relaying to India represents the Western or NATO perspective of what's happening. And that, see, all sides indulge in propaganda. I am not making the claim that only one side is indulging in propaganda. But when it comes to the delivery mechanisms of information, only one side controls that. All of social media is based in the US. Whatever social media Indians consume is based in the US, right? All the media is based in the US. Even these Indian news agencies and media uh, channels, etc., they may have some kind of affiliation with the US in some form or the other, which may not be directly or indirectly visible. So, what we are seeing is nothing but Western propaganda. The Russians are trying to do their own propaganda, but it's not visible anymore because it's been cut off, right? So, in order to get a balanced perspective of what's happening, you have to look at both sides of propaganda. And then you can make your own deductions of what's really happening. Now, like I said the last time also, the best way to see what's really happening in Ukraine is to see a big picture perspective. See the maps. And if I don't have the maps today, last time I showed the maps, you could see clearly from day 1 to day 3 to day 5 to day 10, you could see the Russian control over Ukraine on the map, visibly represented on the map, increasing day by day. So you can see the Russians are doing very well when you look at the map. That's called a top down approach of looking at information and data. But if you look at a bottom up approach, if you look at this piece of information, that piece of news, and this piece of propaganda, that is a very haphazard way of looking at things, right? So, from what I have seen personally, right, and I have been keeping track of what's happening in Ukraine from day one and before day one. So, from what I have seen, there have been very few Russian casualties, soldiers, most likely less than 2,000. According to the media propaganda, like tens of thousands of Russians have died, which is absolute nonsense. Most likely, there have been less than 2,000 Russian soldiers who've died. In a war, people die, especially combatant soldiers. When it comes to warplanes, helicopters, tanks, I mean, I have seen a couple of images of two, three tanks that have been destroyed in whatever reason, and we don't know whether it's a Ukrainian tank or a Russian tank. They all have the same equipment, by the way. When it comes to helicopters, etc., again, how do we know what helicopter it is? They all have the same equipment. What we do know is that within the first 2 to 3 hours, the Russians achieved complete air superiority over Ukraine, which means they took out all the Ukrainian air force and the radars and all the defense mechanisms. Right. So, in the light of that, you may have some sporadic incidents of some helicopter taken down or something, but it's not really happened on a large scale. So it is being made to look like the Russians have suffered lots of casualties. The Russian advance has been bogged down. All the various so-called experts and think tank members, etc., all across Twitter and Facebook and everywhere are pouring out this information that seems to indicate that the Russians have done a terrible miscalculation and they are faring terribly in the war. But if you look at the map of the advance day by day, you can see that the Russians are advancing steadily, right? It's not a lightning advance, it's not a blitzkrieg like we would imagine a blitzkrieg kind of advance to take 24 hours or 48 hours and take over the whole country. But blitzkrieg, the name blitzkrieg comes from the German advance into France in the Second World War. And their advance, this lightning warfare advance, blitzkrieg advance, was slower than the current Russian advance into Ukraine. So let's put things into perspective, right? So the Russians are, I think, advancing steadily. They're doing reasonably well if you disregard the propaganda to the opposite effect. Now the question is, why didn't Russia use all the fighter jets and all those things which they do have, right? Because they don't want to destroy the country. If they had gone, if they had taken the approach that the Americans always take, whether it is Afghanistan, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Libya or wherever, or Yemen, or the former Yugoslavia, the American approach is to go all out and flatten the country first. Nothing should live or breathe there, and then you walk in, and then you conquer the country. That's the American way. and it causes millions of casualties among civilians, as we know, right? I mean, the so-called war on terror has killed at least 6 million civilians, right? And when it comes to the invasion of Iraq that happened in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004, that around that time, that killed at least 2 million civilians in Iraq. Do you Can you comprehend the number 2 million, right? The Russians don't want to do that. They have the firepower, the jets, the machinery, the armed capability, the army, the military capability to completely flatten the country of Ukraine in 24 to 48 hours. They have desisted from doing that. They could have done an all-out attack, the what's known as the so-called shock and awe approach. Bring in all your heavy bombers, uh, shoot thousands of cruise missiles and other missiles, just flatten everything, and then walk in. We won. But that's not what they want to do, right? They want to take the country more or less intact. They just want to change the regime. They want to remove the puppet regime and install their own puppet regime. They want to remove the puppet regime that's been installed by the Americans, and they want to install a pro-Russia puppet regime, right? So it's not about doing what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. It's all about power. They want to regain control over the country. So that's what they're doing, and they don't want to destroy the country. The best way to take a country is to take it intact, right? So that's what they are trying to do, and that's why they have not used all the latest weapons, the best fighter jets, drones, and all those things. They don't want to do it. They don't want to destroy the country. It's not an enemy country. They don't see it as an enemy country. They see Ukraine as their own territory that has been taken away from them. So they want to take it back more or less intact, with as little damage as possible and as few civilian casualties as possible. That is what the approach seems to be, given the pattern we have observed over the past few days, ever since the uh, intervention in Ukraine began. Okay, a couple of questions here. Kirtana says, is there any possibility of India and China entering into an agreement of some sorts, especially after Russia and China's closeness? Will this ongoing scenario help in improving Russia India China relations in some way? And Akash says, the relations of Russia and China with the West are well known to be unsatisfactory, to say the least. Russia and China have come closer in the last few years. Russia and India have always been pretty fine. The US have always supported Pakistan over India. Why doesn't China act smartly and make friendly gesture towards India, leaving the crippled Pakistan alone, at least till the time the supremacy of the West can be put down to rest? Well, it's still early days in the current scenario. The Ukraine invasion, the Russian intervention in Ukraine began in the third or fourth, I think, in late February, right? And we are currently in more or less mid March, so it's still early days in the conflict. And as we know, like both of you have pointed out correctly, the Chinese and the Russians have a reasonably close relationship. You could possibly construe it to be a kind of an alliance. How long will it last is to be seen, but yes, they are cooperating, they are coordinating their approaches, and there seems to be some sort of understanding, satisfactory understanding between them. Now the question is there a possibility of some kind of rapprochement between India and China? Well, it could happen. I mean, it's still early days, like I say. This is going to be this could just be the start of the conflict, right? If you look at the history of, let's say, World War II, it starts. When does it start? 38, 39. There, somewhere around that. I don't remember the exact dates, the years, but the Americans did not get involved into in the war for like 2 3 years. It's only, I think, in 41 that the Americans got involved, and the Germans had been taking country after country at that point. So I don't think the world at that point in time even knew that they were in the middle of a world war, right? It's only later that they realized that what we went through was the Second World War. So who knows what we are in right now? And it's still very early days. You just 2 3 weeks into it, As the situation evolves, the Chinese in the coming year or two may consider it to be wise to make some kind of agreement with India. It is possible. And if it is a mutually beneficial agreement, then even India may be open to that sort of thing. And the stumbling block is the border demarcation. The Chinese have vehemently refused to demarcate the border, and it has they have considered it to be beneficial for them to have an undemarcated border between India and Tibet, Chinese occupied Tibet, because that gives them the opportunity to keep needling India and keep pressurizing India militarily from higher ground in Tibet, in order to keep India off balance and to keep India feeling insecure all the time. Because in the last 30 years, the Chinese have gone way ahead of us economically and militarily. If you have a larger economy, you will have a larger military proportionately. So they see that as a way of keeping their advantage, of driving home, constantly driving home their advantage over India. They don't want India to be stable. They don't want India to feel secure. They always want India to feel constantly off balance. So India always has these problems, and India will not be able to rise uh, to the extent that it should, because they see India as the only potential rival in Asia, right? But if the things go badly in the coming couple of years, 2 3 years, then they may find it to be beneficial for them to perhaps enter into some kind of agreement or cooperation with India. It's possible. So yeah, I would say it's still early days. We have to see how things evolve. The Americans are right now putting a lot of pressure on India as well to capitulate, to give up and become a full-fledged vassal state of the US, and to denounce what Russia is doing, and just slide headlong into the NATO kind of situation. And then they can take over the whole country in a variety of ways, right? Through democracy and through subnational diplomacy and whatever else they call it, which is essentially neo-colonization. So that's what they would like to see happen in India, the Americans, and India is resisting that. So let's see how things goes. It is certainly something that could happen in the future, a kind of alliance between India, China, and Russia. But the precondition for that to happen is that India and China should demarcate the border. The final demarcation should be done. If that happens, then there could be an alliance or agreement between India and China. So depending on how things go, if the let's say Russia doesn't do well, the Chinese are hoping the Russians will do well, and they will support Russia, and slowly they will build a parallel system to the Western system, as an alternative for other countries who are tired of the Western meddling and interference in their internal affairs, whether it is Asia, whether it's Africa or other countries. They may even want Japan or other countries to come into that, possibly, as if they succeed in constructing such a system, an alternative system. But if Russia doesn't do well in the coming 2 3 years, then the Chinese may feel isolated, and then they may want to explore other options. So all the possibilities are open right now, right? So it all depends on how this goes, how the current thing goes. We are still very much in the early days. If the Russians do well and the Americans are not able to destroy the country thoroughly, then certain scenarios may emerge. If the Russians do poorly and the Chinese feel that this supporting Russia in the long run will not work out, then a whole different set of scenarios opens up. So these possibilities are all open right now. In the next 2 3 years, who knows what will happen? We may even end up seeing an India China alliance. The possibility is remote, but it is not zero. So it could happen in the next 2 3 or 5 years. It could happen. Let's see how it goes. I cannot make a prediction because there are too many variables that are currently unknown, but it is a possibility. Okay, Tejas says, should India bring back Indian gold from the Bank of England, seeing the current anti-India narrative in England? I think the figure is as huge as 300 tons. Might be a wrong figure. This is an interesting question by Tejas. So, as from what I last remember reading, India has more than 400 or more than 450 tons of gold that is stored in two banks in the West. One is the Bank of England. The other one is, I don't remember the name of the bank. It's a bank in Switzerland. So there are two banks in which India has stored large quantities of gold. The total amount is most likely more than 450 tons of gold. And we see it as securely stashed away over there. And I think we must be earning some interest on it. But like Tejas says, is it a good idea to bring all that gold back, to repatriate all the gold from the West? Because as we know, if your treasure, if your assets are in somebody else's hands, it's very likely that in the case the situation changes or the relationship between the two sides deteriorates, they may confiscate your property because it's lying in their custody. It is likely, it is possible that such a thing may happen. I mean, recently they have confiscated lots of Russian assets in the last couple of weeks. In the past, they even confiscated the assets of other countries. I don't remember which South American or Central American country it was, but even that was done. So if your valuable assets are in the custody of another country, it is always a possibility that if things go wrong, then they will confiscate it and you will be left with nothing. So I think it may not be a bad idea at all for India to repatriate its gold from the Bank of England and that other bank, which is in Switzerland. I mean, we have a large country, a vast country, a subcontinent sized country. I am sure we can uh, store this gold in various locations across the country securely. I'm sure we can do it. We may not be, if we do that, if we repatriate the gold, we will no longer be able to accrue some interest on it, but that's okay. It is better to have what belongs to you back in your country than gamble on getting a little bit of interest, and you may end up losing everything. So I think it may not be a bad idea for India to, in the coming days, repatriate all of its gold back to India? So that's an interesting question. Dhruv Kaushik says, yeah, all right. Thank you, Dhruv. My question is that the US has banned oil imports from Russia. Russia is offering crude oil to India at a discounted price. So, should India accept this deal and accelerate its growth by using this cheap energy supply? In your opinion, what should India do to utilize this deal as well as not get into the list of Russia supporting nations of the West? You know what's interesting? India used to buy a lot of oil from Iran, our neighboring country, Iran, almost neighboring country. So when the relationship between the Americans and the Iranians went bad, when it went south, the Americans arm twisted India, they pressurized India into stopping its its relationship of buying oil from the Iranians. So India was no longer allowed by the Americans to buy oil from Iran. Do you understand what that means? The Americans can decide what kind of foreign policy India should pursue. What does that tell you? America has a lot of influence in India. I mean, it's all arm twisting, it's all done by force, it's coercion, but they have that sort of influence in India. And India, when they demand such things, India has no option but to accede to their demands and threats, right? So the Americans forced India to stop buying oil from Iran. Now, and what they have also done is that they have imposed a whole lot of sanctions on Venezuela, because Venezuela is a country they don't like, and because it's a socialist country and so on. It's a country in South America, I'm sure you know, right? So they had imposed sanctions on Venezuela. They were preventing other countries from buying oil from Venezuela as well. Now that they have blocked Russia, countries from buying Russian oil, they again want to start buying oil from Venezuela, right? So that is the kind of policy they have. When it suits them, they will do it. When it doesn't suit them, they'll do something else. But for us, we have to dance to their whims and fancies for India, right? So when they demand that we should stop buying oil from a certain country, we have to immediately comply. But next week, if they feel like again starting to, if they feel like buying it again from that country, then they will do it. So there is no consistency in their behavior, right? So that's what I would like to offer to all of you first, that there is no consistency. They talk about a rules based system. There are no rules. The rules change every 5 minutes. The rules change on their whims and fancies depending on what is best for their country. But what's best for us doesn't matter. We just have to obey their orders, right? That's how it is. So the question today is, Should India buy cheap crude oil from Russia? Obviously, it is in India's interest to buy cheap oil wherever it comes from, and we have a good relationship with Russia. Now, the Americans obviously won't like it, but the real question is India in a, in a in a position to buy large quantities of crude oil from Russia? Does India have storage facilities? That's the question. It appears that India does not have large storage capabilities. I mean, I remember reading a few years ago, like 3, 4, 5 years ago, that India was constructing large underground caverns for storing um enormous quantities of crude oil, strategic oil reserves. I'm not sure how far that has progressed, but it appears that as of today, India doesn't have the kind of capacity we should have in order to be able to benefit from such a windfall that a country offers us very cheap crude oil. I am not sure if India has the capacity to store large quantities of such oil. So, in case we have some leftover space in which we can store crude oil, it may not be a bad idea to buy cheap crude oil from Russia. Of course, the Americans won't like it, and India may have to face some repercussions for doing that. So yeah, it's a question that India should consider seriously. But it is also, we have to consider the pros and cons. First of all, do we have the capacity to store a large quantity of cheap crude oil if it comes in? Do we have the capacity? Secondly, if we do have the capacity, if we do have the storage capacity, then is it a good idea to risk the wrath of the US if we buy the Russian oil? Because the Americans are already kind of furious with India, because India has not bent its knee to American demands this time when it comes to voting against Russia in the UN Security Council resolutions. India has refused to vote against Russia. So there is this tsunami of blowback that's coming on India, privately, publicly on social media and other places as well. And there must be diplomatic repercussions also and other things also. So if India goes ahead and does one more thing like this and buys crude oil, then we could face some bigger repercussions from the US, maybe sanctions of some kind. Who knows? Anything is possible. They're already talking about sanctions, the CATSA sanctions, CAATSA sanctions, because India has bought the Russian S-400 missile defense system. So the Americans are not happy about that. Also, they are still considering, they're still threatening that they may impose the CATSA sanctions on India. So we have to see how that goes. So they are already pressurizing us. They are already threatening us. And if we do this, then the threat could really materialize. So the thing is, when it comes to the US, there's always a threat on your head. They are the global hegemon. They are the guy with the biggest stick, and the stick is always ready to fall on your head if you don't behave and if you don't dance to their whims and fancies. So that's where we are. So it is obviously a good thing for India if we have the storage capacity to buy cheap crude oil from Russia. But what are the consequences of doing that? That is what India needs to consider if we have the extra storage capacity. Okay, Akash says, I am learning data science and artificial intelligence from IIT Madras. My question is, this inexorable technology is bound to enter every nook and corner of modern industries. Can ISRO and DRDO also benefit from this? As I would be glad to put my mind in developing national strength instead of increasing profits of US based mega corporations. How crucial can this be in the near future? I mean, very good question. Data science and artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of that is crucial in today's world. It has military applications, it has non-military applications, it has geopolitical applications. It's all about controlling the world and infiltrating the minds of people and so much more. I mean, with data science, you and artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can do things like targeted advertising, targeted propaganda, advanced image recognition, facial recognition, speech recognition. You can do war gaming, you can do predictive analytics, you can do forecasting of all kinds of things. You can indulge in bio warfare, you can create new kinds of bio agents. You can discover new kinds of bio agents using data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence. You can do psychological profiling of people based on their public social media profile, their aggregated social media behavior and trends and patterns. Then you can indulge in warfare. You can create intelligent autonomous weapons systems combined with robotics that can be a game changer. You can do target recognition, combat simulation, combat training, threat monitoring, situational awareness in the battle space domain, and creating an integrated battle space when it comes to warfare on a in a real time manner. So there is so much you can do with data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, neural networks, all of those things. The question is India pursuing these things or not? We have ISRO, we have DRDO, we have HAL, and all these other organizations. Are they agile enough? Are they pursuing these technologies? We also have quantum computing, which is a very important technology, a very important and interesting frontier of science that is currently under development. Is India pursuing that? Uh, in case India is pursuing all these things, then yeah, it would be great to have intelligent young people joining the effort in building up these technologies, developing these technologies for India's benefit. The easy solution is to migrate to the West and work as a glorified cyber coolie to uh, build the platforms for the West, which they will use eventually in the long run against all other countries, right? So in the 1960s and 1970s, lots of Indians, especially from Kerala, etc., they went to the Gulf countries and they exchanged their time for a little bit of money, and they built up what is now all the glittering cities of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, all that. Those were fishing villages. It is Indian labor and Indian talent that constructed all these cities. But who owns the cities? It is the Arabs who own the cities. And what Indians got in return was a little bit of money, which they sent back to their families in Kerala, etc. Right. So the same thing is now happening in the cyber domain. Indians want to live comfortable middle class lives, so they are willing to exchange their time for a little bit of money and create all of this priceless intellectual property for the West. So what India needs to do is give Indians the opportunity to do the same for India. I mean, we need the private sector to contribute in this, and the government also to contribute in this. So DRDO is an organization that could really contribute a lot to that, but unfortunately, DRDO is very antiquated. It is ossified. The kind of system they have is it it the kind of structure that DRDO has, it's very bureaucratic, very stratified. It belongs in the 1960s. I mean, you they have, I don't know, 25,000 employees or so, maybe 30,000 employees, and only 5,000 of these employees at most are scientists. So the majority, more than 20,000 employees, are non-scientific personnel, and all the money that goes into DRDO, most of it is utilized in the salaries and all the other benefits that these non-scientific personnel get. So the majority of the money that goes into DRDO is used for non-scientific work. So these organizations, they need reforms. They can be radically reformed and made more agile, made more driven. And in that, if we can do that, then they could really contribute, they could really transform the country. So I hope that happens. And the thing is this, these technologies, they're going to, like Akash says, they're going to enter every nook and cranny of the modern world. They're going to penetrate your daily lives to an extent that you will not even realize. So we need to also we need to ensure that India needs to ensure it doesn't get left behind. uh, so the answer is, it's really crucial that India develops these technologies. The government needs to push this, the private sector needs to get involved, and if that happens, it will be great for young people in India, people who want to contribute to the country. They will be able to use whatever skills they learn, whatever knowledge they acquire in the course of their studies, and they'll be able to use all this knowledge and these skills for the benefit of the country. So it is crucial that India develops these technologies, India gets involved in this. And I hope that people like Akash, young people like Akash, and many others like him, will get the opportunity to use their talents for the benefit of India instead of building up the intellectual capital for the West. Okay. What do you think about India's fighter attack jet making technological capabilities at present? We all know the horrible time overrun in developing the Tejas, but do you think India has learned her lessons from the Tejas ordeal and applied those lessons in Tejas Mark II, AMCA, Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft, and the twin engine deck based fighter? Also, don't you think it will be beneficial to have a large number of one or two types of planes, let's say 400 Tejas, instead of a lot of small numbers of different planes? Wouldn't it make maintenance and production cost difficult if you have to maintain large numbers of different kinds of planes? Very good question. So, yes, we know that the Tejas program, the LCA Tejas program, was delayed horribly for like it began in the early 1980s, right? The development of the plane, and plane was given the fighter plane was given its final operational clearance only in the 2010s. I'm not sure how many years ago it happened, maybe 5 6 years ago at most, right? So the entire process, it took more than 30 years to develop a basic fighter plane, a light combat aircraft. And the reason for this is not because our scientists are incompetent, it's because our politicians did not want this program to succeed. These politicians who were controlling the country, they were getting large amounts of. I'm not saying all politicians were doing this, but I'm sure some were. So what happened is that the specifications of the fighter jet were repeatedly changed when they were about to be to mature. So when the development when you issue a certain set of specifications, you want the length to be this much, the width to be that much, the wingspan should be these many meters, the weight should be maximum this, and so on and so forth. When you have a set of specifications, the engineers can build a plane based on that. But at the last minute, when the plane is going to be finalized, when you change the specifications, you have to start the development from scratch again. And if this happens repeatedly, then your program will be delayed by decades. And this is not only something that's happened with the Tejas, it's also happened with the HAL Marut, a brilliant plane that was trashed by the Indian government. It was a brilliant fighter plane from the 1960s, the HAL Marut. Firstly, what they did was they gave it an underpowered jet engine, so it was never able to perform to its full potential. And secondly, they did not allow the design to be developed further and to be made more mature and give rise to a Mark II version or more uh, uh, versions or further iterations of the plane. So India could have had a whole family of fighter planes based on the HAL Marut today, but we just shut down the program. Then we started the LCA Tejas program in the 1980s, and it's only in the last 4 5 6 years that the Mark One version has been given its final operational clearance. I don't remember exactly which date it was. Look it up. I don't have all the data stored in my memory, but it's reasonably recent. Now, what we have is is a very good aircraft. It's a light aircraft. It's a small aircraft, but it functions very well. It's a very high quality aircraft. Don't listen to what some experts tell you. All right. There are certain experts who say it's a terrible plane, it's garbage. Please don't listen to them. Please don't. All right. Everybody has some motivations and some agendas. I'm not taking any names, but there are some people who say that. Forget about them. The fact is that the LCA Tejas Mark One is an exceptionally good aircraft. It's not an exceptionally good aircraft. It's a very good aircraft. All right. And that serves as the foundation for future aircraft, which will have modifications and enhancements, which will give them a far better a better advantage than the what so those will be more evolved aircraft. So the Tejas Mark II is going to be a different kind of aircraft. It's going to be slightly larger than the Mark One plane, and it's going to have a number of improvements, a lot of improvements over the Mark One version of the aircraft. Then you have the AMCA, the Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft, which will take all the lessons which our scientists and engineers learned during the process of making the LCA Tejas Mark One, and they will not have to reinvent the wheel from scratch. They will take all of everything they learned, and they're gonna be able to have this new aircraft flying within a decade or so, right? And the same goes for the twin engine deck based fighter. So once you have the experience of developing a high quality flying platform or fighter aircraft from scratch, then you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel every time you design a new aircraft. You already have what works. You know what works, you know what doesn't work. You have learned through painful trial and error what works, what doesn't work, so you can immediately apply it in the design and development of the new aircraft. So every time you make a newer iteration, a newer aircraft, you learn more and more, and it becomes easier and easier for you to build better aircraft. So I think India has learned all the lessons from the Tejas ordeal, and they will be applied. They are already being applied in the design and creation of the new aircraft. There are other aircraft also which are being developed. There is, yeah, let's not go there. All right, so that's what's happening. India has learned the lessons. We are developing a number of aircraft. Now the other question is, will it not be beneficial to have a large number of one or two types of planes instead of small numbers of lots of different kinds of planes? So today we have a number of MiG 21s, a number of MiG 29s. We have the Sukhoi 30s, we have Jaguars, and in the past we had we have the Rafales as well, and we have the LCA Tejas Mark 1, and the Mark 2 will come in. So we have a large number of different models of aircraft, right? So it complicates things. You will need to acquire lots of different spare parts from lots of different suppliers. You will have all kinds of different assembly lines, and you will have mechanics who will have to specialize in one kind of aircraft and things like that. So it complicates things. Instead of doing that, if you have 300 Sukhoi 30s, 400 Tejas aircraft Mark 1 aircraft, and 400 Tejas Mark 2 aircraft, let's say, just three types of planes, and eventually in the future 10 years down the line, you will have let's say 300 AMCAs and 200 twin engine deck based fighters. So if you have large numbers of aircraft but only 2 3 models, it simplifies things. Yes, so it is beneficial to do it that way, especially if you are building your own aircraft in your own country. If you don't have a foreign supplier, it makes things even easier. So in the next 10 20 years, India is going to indigenize everything, and India is going to build its own fighter aircraft. There'll be a fourth generation aircraft, hopefully a fifth generation aircraft as well, and a twin engine deck based fighter for the aircraft carriers and all that. So it makes maintenance easier if you are building your aircraft yourself, and if you have fewer aircraft models. So yes, what you are saying is absolutely right. So that's the direction in which India needs to go. India needs to stop buying planes, aircraft, and other military equipment from other countries, and try to develop its own indigenous arms industry. That will be the best way to go forward in the long run, and it is going to be the thing that is the best for India's national interest. Siddhant says, I read that India is planning to outperform China in the solar panel and semiconductor shortage crisis. What other avenues can India explore to increase our influence and importance for other countries even further? Especially, is there something we can provide to Russia that can potentially save them from becoming a Chinese satellite? India is not planning to outperform country X or country Y. India is planning to become a major power when it comes to solar panel technology, solar energy altogether, and in the semiconductor industry. Because right now, I think everyone would know, there is a semiconductor shortage crisis, which was precipitated by the whole COVID pandemic. So semiconductors, these microchips, etc., they are everywhere. They are required everywhere, from automobiles, from cars to washing machines to computers to everything. And if there's a shortage of that, prices go up. Things, these appliances and these devices, their availability becomes reduced, and so on. So it's a big problem. So India, this government, the current government, has realized how crucial the semiconductor industry is, and the chip manufacturing industry is, for the national security of the country. So India is in the process of setting up this industry in India on a large scale, and hopefully in the next decade, in the next 10 years, India will become a major semiconductor and microchip, etc., power in the world. The industry should take off hopefully in the next 10 years. That is the plan that has been designed, and it is being implemented right now. And also when it comes to solar panels and the solar industry, because India has this enormous surfeit of uh, of solar power. So all the sun that we get, India is a very sunny country. We can utilize it to generate solar power, and that is obviously a green thing to do, right? Climate change and all that. So yeah, that's what India is doing. Now, what other avenues can India explore to increase our influence and importance for other countries even further? India needs to become a manufacturing powerhouse. It's as simple as that. Manufacturing all kinds of things, and if you manufacture things, your technological prowess also improves. You become more advanced technologically, and that's good for the country. So the thing is, when you manufacture all kinds of devices and all kinds of commodities yourself in house in your own country, you don't need to import those things from abroad. That way your economy grows. You save on foreign exchange. You don't have to send money to others to get their commodities. You are able to manufacture everything yourself. And if your manufacturing industry is good enough, then you can even export those commodities to other countries if you are manufacturing things that they need, and that grows your economy. So that's what the Chinese used in the past 30 years to become an economic giant. Now, as we know, the world is trying to look for options other than China. The world is trying to decouple from China to some extent because they understand, they realize that this is creating a monster to some extent. So India could offer an alternative if India gets its house in order. Yeah. So the best way to increase our influence and importance and our stature economically and globally, etc., is to become a manufacturing powerhouse, a manufacturing superpower. That's what India needs to do. If you look at the history of the world, countries that manufacture and countries that export more than they import, they inevitably become major economies. And that's what happened to India historically. Always, India was always a net exporter, always, of various goods and commodities throughout its history. And that's why India was always the largest economy in recorded history until in the last 500, 600, 700 years, right? So that's what India needs to do. India needs to find ways of becoming a manufacturing powerhouse, a manufacturing superpower. Everything needs to be manufactured in house. We need to stop importing things. We need to start becoming an exporter of all kinds of things. That's what India needs to do. How to do it, the government needs to figure out. We have experts in at all levels sitting there. They need to figure out how to do this. It's a challenge, for sure. It's a challenge, but we need to do it somehow or the other. So that's what needs to happen. Is there something we can provide to Russia that can potentially save them from becoming a Chinese satellite? See, right now India has to look out for its own interest. Uh, if India rises, if India becomes a manufacturing power, then maybe we can help Russia in some way. But our first priority has to be India. Everybody's first priority is their own national interest. In the past, for decades, India and Russia were close allies, cooperating together. But it is only because our national interests converged. India was looking out for its own national interest in whatever way it was doing it, and the Russians were looking out for their own national interest. And because the two converged, that's why there was this cooperation, and you could call it an alliance of some kind. So India needs to look out for itself first. Our job is not to help other countries that are in need. Our job is first and foremost to help ourselves and to ensure that our people and our country will be guaranteed long-term security and prosperity. That's what we have to worry about. Our job is not to help other countries in need. That is not our job. It is the job of every country to look out for their own best interests, and that's what India needs to do. Shazam says the recent government restrictions on NGOs. Please explain how will it change India's geopolitical scenario in the coming years? I am not quite sure of what exactly the details are of various restrictions on NGOs. I think there would be some FCRA restrictions, etc. FCRA is the Foreign Currency Regulation Act, and the thing is this. Okay, let's look into what an NGO is. What's an NGO? NGO stands for non-governmental organization, which means that it is an organization that is not in any way linked to the government or any government. And it usually NGO typically works in the field of social welfare, uplifting society, and doing things like that. So that's what an NGO is. Now, what you will find in India is that there are more NGOs in India than schools and hospitals put together. Isn't that strange? So the NGO industry seems to be booming in India. I mean, it was booming in the past. About 10 years ago, you had more NGOs in India than schools and hospitals put together. So why is was this industry so lucrative? NGOs are supposed to be mostly non-profit things, right? And yet, if you look at you take any NGO at random, which is doing reasonably well, and you will find that their employees have very high salaries. And where does the money come from? And these are the questions that typically, obviously, arise, right? And NGOs are allowed to to obtain funds from abroad through the FCRA Act, all that. And the thing is that if you trace back the kind of funding that some NGOs receive, you will find that they are linked to very dubious organizations from abroad. Many of these organizations that are funding Indian NGOs have links to foreign governments. All right. So this term NGO, non-governmental organization, even though it's technically a NGO, it many of these NGOs are basically nothing more than agents of foreign governments. And what we find that there are lots of NGOs that go to the Indian judiciary, start these they file PILs, public interest litigations that are taken seriously by the judiciary, and they are able to influence public policy in India. So NGOs, Indian NGOs, that are more or less puppets of certain foreign powers and forces, are dictating and influencing public policy and government policy inside India. So these NGOs have become a means of exerting foreign interference in India's internal affairs. Whether it comes to government policy, public policy, the kind of rules that are enforced in India, whether it comes to religious conversions or whatever else, you will find that all of this is happening through NGOs, via NGOs. So the term NGO is a misnomer. These NGOs may not be related to the or linked to the Indian government, but many of them are extensions of foreign interests, and they are acting on behalf of foreign governments. Mostly it is Western governments. There are some governments in the Middle East, some organizations in some Eastern countries, maybe some maybe linked to China also. Who knows? I don't have the specific details, but this is how it's done. So there is this massive NGO industry in India. It's very lucrative. They get lots of funding from abroad. Their employees are typically very rich. Not all, but some of them have very prosperous employees who get the salaries in terms of lakhs of rupees per month. Some of them do. Yeah. And they all, not all, but many of them act as conduits of foreign governments and foreign influences within India. So this is a huge national security threat for India. Right. The thing is, if you crack down on NGOs, then certain foreign powers will say that democracy is under threat in India. They will lower your democracy ranking in India. And when you go to that country, their head of state or their vice head of state will give our prime minister lectures about democracy, public lectures, things like that. So you see, there are multiple ways in which very powerful countries can interfere blatantly in the internal affairs of India. All right. When it comes to these so-called protests that happen every winter season in North India, if you trace back the funding, see, no protest can happen without money. No extended protest that goes on for 2 3 weeks, months, can ever happen without a significant amount of funding and logistics. It's not just funding. You need a whole lot of logistics to sustain a protest for a long period of time. And where does all this expertise come from? It comes from NGOs, certain NGOs, I would imagine, which are linked to certain foreign governments. So that's how there is this foreign interference that's happening in India's internal affairs. So that is the reason why the government will have its eyes on the NGOs. I heard recently that there was some restrictions that were made, that were placed on certain NGOs. The thing is, that is problematic, because if you place too many restrictions, then these foreign powers, they will complain, and they will say that India is sliding down under the in the democratic in the democracy index. India is no longer a democracy; it's an autocracy. It's a fascist nation. It is a dictatorship. I mean, this is what the Western media keeps saying day in and day out. And the moment you do this, there will be more of that happening. So, so if India is placing some restrictions on NGOs, it will be because of this only. Now, I would wish that there should be a law that is passed in India that no NGO is allowed to operate if it receives funds from abroad. Right? That's how it should be. There should also be a law that says no political party should be allowed to receive funds from abroad, because all of that is nothing but interference, foreign interference in India's internal affairs. As of today, India is most likely not in a position to pass such a law because of pressure from outside countries. So that's where we are today. So that is a little about the restrictions on NGOs and what NGOs how are and what they actually represent. I am a Swiss born Indian. Whenever I am at an airport, the airport security sometimes mistreats me until I show them a Swiss passport. Raising the tantalizing question of why Indian people need a visa to and go through all these difficulties, whereas people from other countries like Argentina or Mexico, who are much poorer, enjoy visa free access to the EU and even some to the US. There's a word for this. It's called racism. It's all about skin color. Argentina is a Christian country. Most of the people are of European origin. Most of the people who are visible are of European origin. The natives have been mostly wiped out. When it comes to Mexico, Mexico is a brown country. They look like Indians. You go to the US, if you're Indian, people will mistake you for a Mexican very often. But Mexico, again, is a Christian country. It's under the US umbrella. So that's why things are better for the Mexicans if they travel to Europe, etc. But for other brown people from the Middle East, from India, etc., there are all kinds of restrictions. So let's understand how these restrictions started. 100 years ago or 150 years ago, there were no restrictions. There was no requirement to carry a visa or a passport or anything. You could just travel, right? In the old days, the system of passports and visas did not exist. When Mohandas Gandhi went to the UK and from there he went to South Africa, he did not have to apply for a visa to go to all these places. He traveled through various other countries as well while going there. There was no requirement of a visa. So how did all this start? How did these borders become so inviolable? And how did this system of having to apply for a visa before you were able to go to a country, how did all this emerge? So what happened is that in the last 500 years, the Christian countries, the Western countries, the European countries, they colonized most of the civilized world. They destroyed the local culture, civilization, and they plundered and stole all the wealth. They reduced all of these countries, all of these cultures and civilizations to destitution, especially India. They stole all the wealth, and all of the wealth of the East and of Africa as well was transferred into the hands of a small percentage of the world's population, the white skinned people, the Europeans, and their colonies in the US, in North America, South America, etc. So these are the people who now held the vast majority of the world's wealth. Now, if you allow people to travel unrestricted, then you will find that people who have been made very poor will want to now travel to the countries where the wealth resides so that they can enjoy the better living standards. So, to prevent that from happening, all these restrictions were put in place. And because it was the black skinned people of Africa and the brown skinned people of Asia, mostly India, who had been whose countries had been destroyed and whose wealth had been stolen. So the majority, the strongest restrictions were placed on these people, on Indians and on Africans. So today you find that there is this discrimination. If an Indian wants to go to the US, if an Indian wants to go to the EU or whatever, they have to fill up a long visa form and wait for, I don't know how long it is, a week, a month, whatever, for they have to go to the embassy, they have to stand in queue, they have to answer a questionnaire or interview or whatever, and there's a whole number of documents you have to provide to them just to prove that you are worthy of coming to their great country. But when they come to India, when Americans or Europeans come to India, that they complain about the visa process. Oh, it's so tedious, and we were made to fill up this form and things like that. We are accustomed to walking into a country and not needing a visa. So they have these double standards. When it comes to Indians, they want to put all kinds of restrictions in place, but when they come to India, they want to have visa free access to the country, and when they don't get it, they complain, they crib about it, right? So there is the concept of reciprocity, right, which India doesn't follow. Actually, we give too many benefits to these people while we don't get those benefits. So this is all nothing but racism. It all depends to a large extent on the color of your skin. If you are born in Europe, you will know that racism has always been latent in Europe. It's always been like kind of below the surface, but nowadays in times of war, it's all come out into the open. It's very ugly. Racism, I mean, we in India believe that Europe is a very progressive place. There is no racism, there is equality, egalitarianism, very liberal place, very liberal countries, especially the Western European countries. That is not quite the case, my friends. If you live in those countries, you will see that there is a latent racism always below the surface. You're always treated a little differently depending on the color of your skin, and that's how it has always been. So I'm not surprised that you are a Swiss born person and yet you face all these problems with airport security. I am sure elsewhere too. So this is what's known as racism. It's mostly a European thing. It is they who have invented this. Other countries are not racist, not to that extent, at least not to that extent, the way the Europeans are racist. You will find Russians are not racist. You will not see racism among Russians, which is strange. I mean, let me give you an example. When the Indian Prime Minister goes to Washington, see his body language. Is it comfortable or is it kind of not very comfortable? Now, see the Indian Prime Minister's body language when he goes to the Middle East, when he meets the head of state of the UAE or Saudi Arabia. See the body language. It's way more relaxed and comfortable. See the Indian Prime Minister's body language when he meets the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. It's very relaxed, very comfortable. But when the Indian Prime Minister goes to, let's say, Washington and meets the US President, the body language is much more tense. So you can see, I mean, these are very subtle things, but you can observe that. So there is a difference in the way Indians are treated in certain countries, especially in what we know as the West, compared to other countries. So that's just how it is. Okay, since Kennedy offered nuclear technology in 1960-61 to India before the Chinese invasion, and Nehru refused it after the war. But after the war, why did they change their stance and oppose our nuclear program? It's believed that they were behind the death of Homi Bhabha and tried measures to shut down India's nuclear program. My question is, why did they change their stance? So it is indeed true that US President John F. Kennedy had offered nuclear weapons technology to India in the early 1960s, before the Chinese invasion of India. He had offered to help India create, build, and detonate a nuclear weapon. If India had agreed to this, if India had accepted the US offer, India would have been the first Asian nuclear weapons power. Mr. Nehru, the great Mr. Nehru, refused the offer, and as a result, the Chinese became the first Asian nuclear power. If India had nuclear weapons in 1962, the Chinese would probably not have dared to try and invade India. Right. So the Americans wanted India to be the first Asian nuclear weapons power. The Americans wanted India to be an American ally. Mr. Nehru rejected the American offer. In his great wisdom, he was a magnificently wise man. So in his as a consequence of the great wisdom that he had, he rejected the offer. And then what we saw is that he steered India into an alliance with the USSR. India essentially became a satellite state of the USSR. I know some people don't like me saying it. Deal with it. India became a satellite state of the USSR over time. Right. So the Americans wanted India to be an ally of the US, maybe a satellite state, a client state of the US. But what they saw is that India, under Mr. Nehru, very rapidly became a client state or a satellite state of the USSR. So essentially, India went into the enemy camp. The Cold War was already on. Early 1960s, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Cold War was very much on. It was threatening to become a hot war. And India had taken unambiguously the side of the USSR and rejected the offer of the US. So India declared itself. The signals that India gave to the US was, we are allying with your enemies. So that's very simple. That's why they changed their stance, right? Initially, the Americans also wanted India to become one of the five permanent members of the UN Security Council. The offer was made to India twice. The second time the offer was made to India was in conjunction with the Russians. The Russians and Americans both offered India a place on the UN Security Council, a permanent place. And Mr. Nehru, again, in his great wisdom, he rejected that. So after seeing all of these rejections, the Americans said there's no point dealing with India and the Congress regime under Mr. Nehru and whoever else. And that's why they quickly changed the stance. And from then on, you saw that the Americans, uh, they started cultivating Pakistan, and eventually they even cultivated the Chinese uh, from the mid 1960s onwards. So that's how it went. But the reason why they changed the stance is very simple. It's because India rejected their offer and became, instead of that, an ally of the USSR. Now, some of you will say, no, 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 what are you talking about? You are stupid. India was non aligned. So, how can you say India was an ally of the USSR? We had declared, we had said many times we are non allied. Are bhai, do you understand the difference between actions and words? Non alignment was words, but every action that India took was that of an ally and a satellite state of the USSR. Please understand the difference between actions and words. All right. So that is why the Americans very rapidly changed their stance, and then the relationship between India and the US became quite adversarial. Swaroop says Stephen Tibbetts, co-founder and chief executive of Ziva Aero, a Tacoma, Washington-based firm, has designed a prototype of a flying saucer-like vehicle, which recently had a successful full-scale vertical takeoff. Even the UAE has been working on such vehicles for public transport for since a few years. So, do you think such kind of air travel will be the future of traveling in the distant future? No, 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 no. It will not be the future of traveling on a large scale in the distant future. What these companies are creating is they are creating expensive toys for rich people. So when you have a helicopter kind of thing, or a hovercraft kind of thing, or something that looks like a UFO, it's gonna be something that everybody desires, but only rich people can afford. It cannot be something that can be used for mass transportation. Even the biggest planes that we have today, the Boeing 747s and the Airbus 400s, A400 or whatever, they can be afforded mostly only by the rich people of the world, right? I mean, the common man and woman in India would rarely travel by air, right? Maybe once a year, maybe once in 2 3 years, if at all. So even regular air transport is, at least for countries like India, kind something of a luxury to some extent. The things are changing now. Even common people can afford to travel by air. Things are changing, but until very recently, it was kind of a luxury. Now these vehicles that these people are creating, flying saucer like things, these are going to be really expensive things. What you need is mass transportation. Mass transportation means large vehicles like trains that can transport 1,000 2,000 people at one time, and that are inexpensive and that are available on demand. I mean, let's say you want to go, let's say you are living in Bangalore or Chennai, and you wake up tomorrow morning and you have this urge to go to, let's say, Guwahati. And let's say then, okay, you go to the station, you buy a ticket, and 2 hours later you're on a train and you can go there. So if that sort of situation is accessible to you, that is mass transportation. That is mass transportation, transportation that is available and accessible. When it comes to a flying saucer like vehicle, it's going to cost a lot of money. Only a few people will be able to afford it, and it's not going to be a solution for mass transportation. It's going to be a one seater or two seater or maybe four seater or maybe 20 seater, and it's going to be really expensive. So it is not going to be the future of air travel. These are just expensive toys. The future of the future of traveling transportation in the long run, in my opinion, most likely will be ground based travel, maybe high speed railways, maybe underground railway systems or whatever, but something that can carry lots of people, large numbers of people, at speed, at scale, and bring them from point A to point B in a reasonably short amount of time. So all these fancy vehicles, these are nothing but toys for rich people. So that's how I see it. Archit says, we all know our GDP was more than 33% of the world's GDP, at least, maybe more. But what about our per capita GDP? Do you think that was a boastful number too, given how this land has always had a huge population? Interesting question. So, India, see, if you look at the statistics, the data that Angus Madison, the economist, put forth, you will see that according to his calculations, projections, which is the gold standard in the economic history of the world, according to his calculations, India always had a GDP of at least one third of the world's GDP until the 1700s, at which time our GDP dropped very precipitously because of the British destruction of India's economy and the country. Now, India's population, if we look at the population of history of India, India's population was typically, when the British left India, undivided India had a population of approximately between 300 and 350 million, which is, if it was 300 million, it is one fourth of what India's population is today, right? And if you look at the large scale history of India, so let's go back a few thousand years. If we go back about to around 3000 BC or 3500 BC, we had the Sapta Sindhu phase of India's civilization, the Saraswati Sindhu phase of India's civilization, with which the Western people call the Indus Valley civilization or the Harappan civilization, which is nothing but one phase of India's civilization. So if you go back to that time, India was demonstrably demonstrably the most technologically advanced culture in the world, a fully industrialized, fully urbanized civilization with the highest technology available at that time anywhere in the world. And at that time, I can guarantee that India's GDP would have exceeded half the world's GDP. And at that time, it is estimated that India's population was around 5 million. 5 million. Not 300 million, not 1.4 billion, which we are reaching today. It was merely 5 million. So more than half the world's GDP for 5 million people. Can you imagine the per capita GDP which we would have had? So we have to put things in perspective. This is a very interesting question. I mean, I wish that people would think more along these lines. So we have to look at what the population was like from the best estimates that historians and scholars have. So the best estimate for India's population uh, during the Saraswati Sindhu phase was about 5 million people. And India's GDP was more than 50% of the world's GDP for sure. Maybe two-thirds of the world's GDP, because that's how advanced India was. So the per capita GDP would have been ridiculously high, more than any other country even today. So these are not boastful numbers. The numbers are actually underrepresentations of what India would actually be. India's GDP would actually be, because even if you look at the data that Angus Madison has put forth, there are a number of assumptions and oversimplifications that are not quite accurate when it comes to India. So even the data for the last 2000 years, which says that India was about one third of the world's GDP, is kind of an underrepresentation of what it actually would have been. Even in the last 2000 years, the actual data, the actual GDP of India would have been closer to, I would say, 40 to 45% of the entire world's GDP, most likely, more likely. So that's what I can offer. But in the past, uh, before 0 AD or 0 BC, whatever you call it, India's economy was even more advanced, and the per capita GDP would have been really, really high. And again, by Archit, There are always claims that education in ancient India was great, but very limited to certain sections of the society, leaving a large part uneducated. What's your take on that? Do you think that might be true? I don't necessarily see that as bad, or even if true. China still does this, which and so on and so forth. Just curious how you think ancient India dealt with education. So there are claims that certain sections of India's in of historians and researchers, they make these claims that India was a very inegalitarian society, unequal society. You had this caste system in India. Arey bhai, caste system, casteism, Brahminical society, Brahminical patriarchy, Brahminical domination, and the evil Brahminical religion, which only gave education to the Brahmins and maybe the Kshatriyas, and everybody else was denied education. Even women were treated horribly in India because India is a terrifyingly patriarchal society, right? So that's what these people claim, and that's what we are taught in our education system. We are taught all of these things as if they were facts. But on what basis do they make these claims? If you make a claim, it has to be on the basis of data, of information. Where is this data? On what basis have they claimed that it's in so and so period of time we had these problems, that India did not denied education to large parts of society and denied education to girls and women? Where is the data that supports this claim? Did they pull this data out of thin air or somewhere else? There is no data that supports these claims that these people make. The only data that is available about not ancient India but more recent India is the data that is available in this book, The Beautiful Tree, by Dharampal. And he meticulously and painstakingly collected all the data that the British themselves had documented. So before the British destroyed India's education system, they spent several decades collecting data about the kind of education system India had, what what kind of education was imparted, what was the demographics that was included in that, and so on and so on, so on and so forth. So according to the data that the British themselves collected before they destroyed India's education system, everybody got an education. The so-called high castes, the so-called low castes, everybody got education in the temple schools. So the place, so India was a land of temples until recently. Today we have other things that are cropping up. Temples, no more new temples are coming up now in India. But India has, for thousands of years, been a land of temples. Every city, every village, every street corner had a temple. And temples were not just places of worship; these were centers of education. So in small temples, there is a saying in Tamil that don't go and live in a village where there is no temple. Right? So this is not a secular saying. This is a Hindu saying, isn't it? So, so what you see is that what was there is that these temples, these were centers of education. That's where all the local kids would go, in the local temple, to gain their basic education. So what they were taught was, they were taught Sanskrit, they were taught the mother tongue, and they were taught basic mathematics and whatever else, right? Uh, Whatever other basic topics were taught. So the main basic things, basic education. And if you were good in studies and you wanted to pursue higher education, you would go to one of the great temples. So the great temples were not everywhere, but in every you could say district kind of area, you would have one great temple. So you would go there to receive a higher education, and if you wanted to receive an even higher education, you would go to one of the mahaviharas or one of the great universities like Nalanda, Takshashila, and so on and so forth. So that's how the system was. India was the most educated land in the world, the most educated culture in the world, right? So according to the statistics the British collected, in which Dharampal has presented, everybody got an education. The so-called high caste, the so-called low castes, boys, girls, everybody got an education. Go buy the book and read it. All right. So that's the only data we have. And the other data, which is like data that comes from foreigners, is the accounts of people like Xuanzang and Fahian, etc., the Chinese pilgrims and monks who used to come to India to acquire education, because India was the home of education, right? So they would come to India to acquire knowledge, wisdom, education, and they also observed that everybody was educated, right? You even had female monks and all that. Even in the Vedic times, you had female rishikas. Many of the verses of the Rig Veda itself, the oldest literary text in human history. Many of the verses of the Rig Veda have been composed by females, by ladies. The Rig Veda is the holiest book in what we now call Hinduism. Show me any other religious book in which a significant portion of the text has been composed by women. So all of these claims that these so-called scholars and historians make, these are outright lies and fabrications. So fabrications. Show me the basis on which they make these claims. These are merely opinions. And what they do is this: one person puts forth an opinion without any basis, without any factual basis. Then 15 other people, and this person puts forth the opinion in the form of a paper, a research paper. That paper is published in some journal, even though there is no factual basis to the claim, but they publish it anyway. Then 15 other so-called scholars will cite that paper, that research paper, and write new articles, which all make the same claim. Again, repeat the same claim. So now we have 15 or 16 papers which make the same false claim. Then lots of other people will cite those 15 papers, and they will create a citation ring around that. And so many papers will now, after a few years, be there which all make the claim, and they cite each other. So they give references to each other, but it all starts with one false claim. And that's how these narratives are constructed in academia. So academia is rotten. Whether it is the West, whether it is in India, whether it's anywhere else, academia is rotten. The entire academic system in the world today is built upon the foundations of the Western system, the Western colonial system that was introduced in India in the 19th century. We still follow the same system today in the 21st century. The same old master's degree in English literature and all that nonsense which people have to go through. So these are all lies and fabrications. Please don't believe them, because there is no factual basis to these claims. Okay, Muhammad Danish Khan says, "What do you think India would be like today if if it had not been colonized? Would it be a single country or multiple kingdoms?" Well, what India would be, whether it would be a single political unit or multiple units, India would still be a single civilization. Today, India no longer has the status of a civilization. Let me explain why. A civilization has certain characteristics. It is characterized by high levels of education, high levels of prosperity, high living standards, a single unifying civilizational language, and a single unifying culture, which may manifest itself in various forms. So, single unifying civilizational language, and all of its institutions should be based in its own indigenous culture. If we look at India, we have a unifying language today, which is English. I am forced to speak to you in English, right? We have institutions and laws which are based in Western values and Western principles and Western morality. India's constitution is Western in origin. It is not Indian in origin, right? It is not based on Indian values, on Indian cultural and civilizational values. India's institutions, whether it is the parliament, whether it is the judiciary, they are all based on Western institutions. India's laws are not based in Indian values. So India is a thoroughly colonized country. And once you have this kind of situation, you are no longer a civilization. So India officially ceased to be a civilization in 1947. Until 1947, India was a struggling civilization. But in 47, the death of the civilization was announced when India accepted British dominion status. And in 50, 51, or whatever, whichever year it was, we adopted this ridiculous constitution undemocratically. And since then, we have no longer been a civilization. We have been a colonized a colonized nation state, Westphalian nation state. So if India had not been colonized, whether if India today was a single political entity like the Mauryan Empire, the Kushan Empire, whatever, or whether it was a loose coalition of various kingdoms, India would still be a single civilization. So that is what we have lost due to colonization. And today we are becoming even more rootless. All of our values are Western values. All the entertainment we watch is rooted in foreign culture. The education system is making us more rootless, and this is the situation we are in right now. If it persists like this for another 100 years, everything that is left of Indian culture will be gone. So that's where we are today, but I am still hopeful that things may turn around. So India may have been today a single country, a single kingdom, you could say, or empire, whatever, or maybe a bunch of multiple kingdoms, whatever. But it would have still been a single indigenous civilization, which we no longer are today. So that's an interesting question. Danish has asked. Vishal says Gautam Buddha was called Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakyas. My question is, were the Shakyas and the Sakas, the Scythians, the same? Was Gautam Buddha a Scythian? That's an interesting question. So even I used to believe, 10 years ago or so, that the Shakyas and the Sakas or the Shakas were the same. It may not be the case. So who were the Scythians, the Sakas or the Shakas? These were Indian origin nomadic people. So in the old days, in the days of the Vedas, in the Puranas, in the Vedic age, there were multiple waves of migration out of India to the west, to the north and the west. And the people who migrated out of India went and settled down in Persia, to the west of Persia, and all across Central Asia. And after a few years, after a few decades, maybe a couple of centuries, they kind of gave up some of the values and some of the traditions of India. So they no longer followed the Vedic lifestyle properly. So that's why they were given the name of mlechas. But they were still Indian origin people. The entirety of Central Asia was Indian origin. You still find ruined stupas and ruined temples all across Central Asia, everywhere. You even find ruins of Hindu temples in Georgia and Armenia and places like that in the Caucasus region, and there must be many more. So the whole of Central Asia was was Indian, and you had these nomadic people who were of Indian origin. We know what they looked like based on their DNA analysis. They had light brown skin, brown eyes, and dark hair, and they were reasonably tall. So these were known as the Scythians. The Scythians ruled the Central Asian steppe region. Right, they were nomads and they were very powerful warriors, but they did not stay in one place for long. They were nomads. So these were the Scythians, and eventually, about 2,000 years ago, they reintroduced themselves into India. They conquered parts of northern and western India, and they assimilated very harmoniously within the Indian population because they essentially were the same people, the same culture. There was no significant difference between Indians and Scythians genetically or culturally. So the assimilation was very harmonious. And you had many great Scythian kings in Western India. Rudra Daman, Rudra, forget all the names, but you had these great Mahakshatrapas, especially in Western India, in Gujarat, Saurashtra, etc. They controlled India's great ports that did all the trade with Rome, etc., Egypt, and so on. So these were the Scythians, Indo-Scythians, and the Central Asian Scythians, the same people. One could also consider the Kushans to be the easternmost Scythians. So these guys, the Scythians, re-entered India about 2,200 or so years before today, approximately. Now, Gautam Buddha, according to conventional historiography, according to the conventional chronology of India, of India's history, he lived about 200, 2,500 years before today, around 500 BC, thereabouts. Uh, that's what the official consensus is. So if he lived in 500 BC approximately, that would predate the time of the Scythian reintroduction into India by about 3 centuries, right? Because during the Mauryan era, or before the Mauryan dynasty, before the Mauryas, you had the Nanda dynasty, right? During the time of the Nanda dynasty, there was no significant intrusion of Scythians into India, none whatsoever, almost, right? And so, therefore, it is unlikely that Gautam Buddha, Siddhartha Gautam, the prince of the Shakya people, would have been a Scythian. So maybe it's just a coincidence that you had a clan of people or a community of people, Kshatriyas, warriors, who were called the Shakya people, and to whom Gautam Buddha belonged. So most likely, I would say that the Shakyas of northern India, present day Nepal and Bihar, etc., most likely they were not Scythians, right? So that's what I can conclude based on the chronology and all of this historical background. So most likely Gautam Buddha was not a Scythian. He was a northern Indian Kshatriya from a princely, from an aristocratic royal family. Okay, Akash says, why was Albert Einstein so adamant on the cosmological constant that the universe is static, and later he had to delete it from his field equations? What does it say about the scientific community's temperament against the inflow of new and exceptional ideas? One more example could be that of Avi Loeb, who says Oumuamua could be an extraterrestrial object, but he was completely sidelined. P.S. It would be great if you could call Avi to a podcast. He is a great speaker, explains complex ideas beautifully. Okay, interesting. Thank you for the recommendation. Let's see if I can do that. So the question is about the cosmological constant. So what is this cosmological constant? So in 1915, Albert Einstein published his general theory of relativity. In 1905, he published the special theory. In 1915, he published the general theory of relativity. In the general theory of relativity, you have the very important equation called the field equation of general relativity, which relates the mass and energy with gravity, and it replaced the older law of gravitation, which is Newton's law of gravitation. So what you have, according to the Einstein field equation, is that the curvature of space-time is intricately related to the amount of matter and energy that is passing through that region of space-time, right? So that's the Einstein field equation. If you want to understand what the equation is, it says r mu nu minus 1 half r g mu nu is equal to 8 pi g above c upon c raised to 4 times t mu nu. So that is the field equation. It's not a single equation, it's a set of 10 equations. Looks very simple. It's a system of 10 partial differential equations which relate the mass and energy to the curvature of space-time, right? So this set of equations, it matches Newton's law of gravitation for weak gravitational fields. Now what we find, so what Albert Einstein did is that he what he did was he approximated the universe as having a constant density in all directions. So if you look at the universe, it has mass in some places, it is empty in some places, but if you zoom out to very large scales, then you find that it has, you could approximate it as having a constant mass energy density in all directions. So Einstein did that approximation, and he was able to solve the equations for a simplified toy universe with constant density everywhere. And what he found is that the equations, the solutions, they give you something. They will either cause the universe to contract or expand, right? So that's what his equations were telling him, that the universe will either contract or expand. But in those days, in 1950s, in 1915, in maybe in 1920, the data, the information that we had was that the universe was static. It was unchanging. It was neither expanding nor contracting. Those days, the only knowledge we had was that of the Milky Way galaxy. And we thought, scientists in those days thought that the Milky Way was the entire universe. Right. So that was the scientific consensus. That's what the best observations showed. Now, in the 1920s, Edwin Hubble, an American astronomer, he took he observed that the Milky Way was just one galaxy. There were lots of galaxies beyond the Milky Way, and he also discovered that these galaxies beyond the Milky Way were all getting more and more distant from us. They were all receding from us in all directions, which indicates that the universe is not static, it is expanding. Right? So, before this information was available, Einstein realized that his field equations, they would make the universe expand or contract. So what he did was he introduced an additional term, which is the cosmological constant. And what this constant does is that in order to counteract the contraction of the universe, it produces a net outward force. It's like a repulsive gravity kind of force to balance out the contraction of the universe, right? So that's what it did. And later on, when it was discovered that the universe is actually expanding, then he realized that my field equations were telling me this all the time, and I inserted this equation, which with this term in the equation, which may not have been necessary. So he called the cosmological constant that he inserted into the field equations his greatest blunder. Right. So that's what he did. It is denoted by the Greek term lambda. Now, in the late 1980s or late 1990s, it was discovered that the universe is not just expanding, but the expansion of the universe is accelerating. The universe is expanding faster and faster. The expansion is accelerating. And this term, the cosmological constant that had been deleted from the field equations, now had to be reintroduced because it represents an anti-gravity kind of force, a negative gravity kind of force that causes the expansion of the universe. So Einstein's greatest blunder actually was valid, right? And that's what we nowadays consider to be dark energy. So nobody forced Albert Einstein to delete the cosmological constant from his field equations. He did that himself because it was discovered. New data came into was new data was made available, and based on the new data, he realized that there was no need for it. But after his death in the late 90s, it was again realized with the introduction of even more data that yes, we need such a term in the Einstein field equations because the universe is expanding and the expansion is accelerating. So that is the story in brief, in rough, about the cosmological constant. Now, when it comes to the scientific community, the temperament against, like Akash says, inflow of new and exceptional ideas, it's always been there. Whether it is the scientists, whether it is any other community, there's always this resistance towards new ideas. Nobody likes new ideas. For instance, we have had this stranglehold of the string theory mafia in theoretical physics for many decades. If you look at the US, most of the funding in physics, in theoretical physics, goes into string theory. So if you want to have a career in theoretical physics in the US, you need to be in string theory these days. It's been like that for a very long time. Nowadays, there are questions have been raised about it and all. So it's always been like that. So there is always this group think mentality. There is always this thinking by consensus, and that's always been there. So, and that's one of the reasons why there's been no new real breakthrough in theoretical physics since 1980. Since since the theory of inflation was introduced by Alan Guth, there was 1980 or 81. After that, there has been no new genuine breakthrough, theoretical breakthrough that is supported by uh, experimental observational evidence since 1980 or 81. So theoretical physics has hit a brick wall because of this groupthink mentality, because of the temperament against the inflow of new and exceptional ideas. And like you say, Avi Loeb said that Oumuamua could be an extraterrestrial object, and the entire scientific community condemned that. Why? It is certainly possible it could be an extraterrestrial alien object, but so there was this very strong backlash against this theory, which is perplexing. That's not how you're supposed to behave as a scientist. So you have all these problems in science today. Akash again says, what is the definition of life according to science? I read there is no consensus on it. Death is defined as irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain. My question is, what keeps us alive and what dies when someone dies? Because according to the Bhagavad Gita, it's the divine soul that allows the functioning of the insentient matter, which we call body. And even for a layman, it sounds extremely commonsensical, maybe even, except maybe for militant atheists. Okay, there is no one definition of life according to science. If you look at it from the perspective of neuroscience, there is a certain definition. If you look at it from the perspective of biochemistry, there is a certain definition. If you look at it from the perspective of physics, of thermodynamics, there is a different perspective, a different definition. So the mainstream definition of life is more biochemical in nature. Life is seen as a biochemical process, which itself is problematic because the biochemistry can stop for some time. And if it is, see, for instance, there have been instances of people who went into a coma or went into a shock kind of state. Their heart stops, and their heart doesn't beat for like 15, 20 minutes, and then they are successfully revived by shocking their heart or whatever, and then they are brought back to life. So if the definition is a biochemical definition, which would indicate that the heart would stop and various biochemical processes would stop, then the person would have died, would have been considered to be dead. And then when the heart restarts after 20 minutes and the consciousness comes back, does it mean that the person came back from death? Which is not quite true, right? So there are problems in all the various definitions of life, and the reason for that is that life is not a substance, it is a process. What exactly the process is, we don't quite know. We don't understand the body. We don't understand the body well at all. If you There is this guy, very famous guy, what's his name, Yuval Noah Harari. He says he says that the human body is nothing but a hackable machine. The human body is it's an animal that can be hacked. There is no such thing as the spirit or the soul. It's all just a set of systems that can be hacked. That's what he says. So I don't agree with this sort of definition. The human body is not a machine with a set of systems that are interconnected. Lots of scientists have such perspectives. Lots of scientists have very different perspectives, but those perspectives now become mainstream. See, in the West today, you have this commercialization. There is this reduction of the human being to a commodity. You are just one. You are you are simply part of the big market, and they want to commodify everything. Even the pharmaceutical industry is commodified. Even healthcare is commodified. So they want to hack human beings. They want to reduce human beings to mere numbers and commodities. And in that system, uh, the idea of the spirit and the soul is very problematic, because then you have to treat human beings and all life differently, not just as numbers and commodities. The problem is that from the perspective of science, there is no definition of life. There is no definition of soul. There is no definition of spirit. So now, when we talk about the Bhagavad Gita, we are no longer talking about science. So we have to understand this very correct, very carefully. That science is about. I have said this many times. Let me repeat it. Science is about physical. Uh, what is science about? Science is about physical objects and observable and measurable phenomena. Spirituality is about non-physical objects also, and non-observable phenomena also. So when you talk about the soul and the spirit, we are no longer talking about science. We're talking about either philosophy or spirituality, right? So from the perspective of science, there is no definition of soul or spirit, because a soul or a spirit cannot be observed, it cannot be measured, right? So uh, so you have scientists who say that the human emotions are nothing but chemical reactions. I don't agree with that. It's as if we understand everything and that's all it is. We don't understand the brain. We don't understand the mind. We don't understand the body. We don't understand our genes. More than 95% of the genome is not understood at all. And they call it the dark matter of the genome. And yet people are trying to hack the human genome and do all the genetic engineering. They don't even understand what could happen, what could be the consequences. You understand less than 2% of the human genome, but you want to start hacking around. So that is the kind of approach that we have today. Without understanding things, we want to start modifying things, right? So the truth is, we understand almost next to nothing about our genome. We understand next to nothing about our neurochemistry, about the human brain, about the human mind. We don't know what consciousness is. We don't have a definition of consciousness. Is consciousness an emergent phenomenon that emerges out of the complexity of our brain? Or is it something else altogether? We don't know. We don't have the answer. We don't even have a proper definition of life. I mean, viruses, according to various definitions of life, viruses are half living, half dead. They do have DNA, they do reproduce, but they have some characteristics that are more consistent with the properties of crystals and non living objects than living objects. So, this is a complex field. Life doesn't have a clear definition. The consciousness itself, which does exist, we know it exists. So it is something that does exist. It is not an unmeasurable phenomenon, it is an observable phenomenon. But we don't quite have a definition of that. And maybe the consciousness is what is connected to what is known in philosophy and spirituality and religion as the soul or the spirit. So we don't quite know. Our understanding of science is very rudimentary. It is very limited. There are plenty of scientists who like to pretend like science can explain everything. Science cannot explain lots of things. It doesn't mean that science is wrong. It means that our level of intelligence is able to perceive only a certain amount of science, and the and that our understanding of science is very limited. It doesn't mean science is wrong. Maybe in the future science will be able to deal with things like consciousness and other such things as well. So that's what I can say. I don't know what keeps us alive, what dies when someone dies. We know, but no scientist has the answer. Our ancients, our philosophers, our great gurus, rishis, etc., did have the answers. Those answers can be found in our scriptures, in our Upanishads, in the Vedas, in the Bhagavad Gita, etc. But that cannot be brought into the realm of science because it is not science. The Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, these are spiritual and philosophical texts, civilizational and cultural texts. These are not scientific texts. So science is very limited in its scope, and science cannot explain what life and death are, what the spirit is, what the soul is, if it does exist, and what consciousness is, which does exist. So these are the significant limitations that science uh, is constrained by. Okay, Sana Thoibi says the Chinese were and are still a high level society. They have diversities in their food, attire, culture, and even variations in the school of thought and philosophy, Confucianism and Taoism, etc. They relatively opt for an ideal, peaceful life. So, why did they adopt communism midway? Does it aid the Chinese government to reach their goals faster? I see communism as creating tension among its people. And the reason for their aggressiveness, please shed some light. Please understand this. The Chinese people did not decide one day to hold an election and decide that, yes, based on the result of the election, we will all adopt communism now. That's not what happened. It is the Chinese Communist Party that won the Chinese Civil War. It defeated the Kuomintang. It took control of the country by force and imposed communism, which was its ideology, on the people of China. Nobody was given a choice whether you accept or not. Everybody had to accept it because they had the power of the gun. What did Mao Zedong say? He said, political power flows from the barrel of a gun. So communism was imposed top down on the Chinese people by the Chinese Communist Party after the Chinese Communist Party's victory in the Chinese Civil War, when they defeated the Kuomintang and exiled them to the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan. So the Chinese people did not adopt anything. They were made to swallow communism wholesale by force by the Chinese Communist Party. That is what happened. All right. And today, the Chinese, today China is no longer a communist country. China is an imperial system today. The Chinese president, Mr. Xi Jinping, is essentially the emperor of China. And they no longer have this communist model of collective property, collective wealth, and all of that. China is a capitalist society today, an out and out capitalist society, and yet a very controlled economy. And all the power resides in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. So it is no longer a communist country, it is an imperial system. It is a proper imperial system. They have reverted to the system they have always followed for the last 2,500 years. That's what China is today. So they went through a phase of communism under Mao Zedong. After Mao Zedong died, with the ascent of Deng Xiaoping in China, the system was transformed. They slowly moved to a state-controlled capitalist system. So that's what we see today. And they tried to copy the Singapore system to a large extent. The system that was implemented by Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, which completely transformed Singapore in just a couple of decades. So that's what happened in China. China is not a communist country anymore, and the Chinese people had no say in what happened there. It was something that the Chinese Communist Party imposed on the country. All right. Dungar Singh Chauhan says, I sometimes think there is no meaning to my life because I don't know about the very next moment of my life. No matter what I become or gain in my life, but one day I'll be gone. None of these things will have any impact on me after I'm gone. I don't even know whether individuality will exist or not. I can't focus on my studies, nor do I find any aim of my life because I am foreseeing that there is no meaning to this material world. Then I naturally tend to move towards spirituality. Sir, do you get such thoughts? How do you deal with it? Interesting question by Dunga Singh Chauhan. So, what you are describing is known in some quarters as nihilism, that life has no meaning, existence has no meaning. What's the point of doing whatever we do? What's the point of existence? I have never personally gone through that phase. Um, so the thing is this: there is no meaning to the material world. All that I can't. The thing is this: see, every single person in the history of humanity has died, right? So death is inevitable, but that doesn't mean that we have to think about death all the time. Just as we are born, one day we die. That's how it is, and nobody is exempt from that. From that. So one day everybody is going to be gone, but it doesn't mean that our life, our existence, whatever, however long it lasts, is meaningless, right? Um, the trick is to find meaning. The trick is to find your own purpose in life. Everybody has a certain purpose. And how do you find your purpose in life? It's by looking inward, first of all, trying to understand who you really are, truly deep inside. See, every person is unique. Every person has a unique personality and character. I know for a fact that I am today at this age the same person, exact same person I was when I was 2 years old. I have acquired a whole lot of knowledge. I have acquired a whole lot of behavioral traits. I am wiser with the years. I've acquired certain maybe behavioral traits and all that, certain attitudes. But who I am deep inside is still the same as what I was when I was 2 years old. There's been no change really. So we are all something unique, and whatever is intrinsic to us never changes throughout our life. And to find our purpose in life, we have to first look inward and find out who we really are. And the problem with most people, all of us mostly, is that we never get the time to spend alone with ourselves and to introspect. We are always interacting or consuming things, consuming information, consuming entertainment, music, whatever. And the problem with today's entertainment is it imposes this attitude or this mindset of nihilism on all of us. Recently, very recently, a couple of weeks ago, less than a week ago, I went and watched this Hollywood movie, Batman, the latest Batman movie. My goodness, how depressing that movie was. Dark, nihilistic. They are glorifying depression, they're glorifying mental illness. They are showing that relationships have no meaning, the world has no meaning, your life has no meaning. Even if you may love somebody, you should not be with them, that sort of thing. So that's what Hollywood is glorifying today, and the more we consume this sort of entertainment, the more we're going to feel that way, right? The truth is that life is beautiful. Life can be beautiful, life should be beautiful, life can be and should be meaningful, but you will not find your meaning and purpose in life unless you spend some time alone with yourself and try to understand who you really are. And the best way to spend a useful, meaningful life and to be happy is to help others and serve society in some form, in some way. That if you do that, if you spend all your time in doing something, in creating something good or contributing something good to society in a way that makes you happy deep inside, then you will not find that your life has been meaningless when the time comes to go, right? So you have to first find what makes you happy. Everybody has something that makes them happy, and that is the meaning that you seek in life. That is the meaning you need to find in life. So everybody needs to do that, especially when you're young. When you're young, you're confused. When you're young, you are clueless. I have been there. When you are 18 years old, when you're 15 years old, when you're 20 years old, you are clueless. You may think you know lots of things, but you are clueless. Everybody goes through that phase. And sometimes you're lost. Sometimes you don't know what is the meaning in life. Sometimes you have this enormous pressure of society, right? Study for 20 years. Study 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day. You're not allowed to play sports. You're not allowed to do anything interesting. You're forced to study for hours and hours. So you don't find anything good in life. You don't find anything fulfilling in life. And once you're done with your studies, you have to go and get a job. And then you are under the pressure of the job. And your bosses and your co-workers will have all this influence on you. So you never find anything fulfilling in life. That's the problem that everybody goes through today. That's the kind of society that we have created in India today. Look at the back-breaking burden that we are placing on little kids. School, and after you're done with school, homework and expectations, exams, year after year after year. No wonder there is so much depression among kids today, right? So what we need to do, my dear friends, is to find some time to step back, breathe, spend some time alone, discover who you really are, discover the spark of divinity inside yourself, find what really makes you happy, and pursue that. You will have pressures from society, you will have pressures from family, from your co-workers and all that, but you have the strength to rise above that. Also discover the source of that strength. And the thing is, yes, we're all going to die, but if you spend a life that is useful to others, if you help others, if you make others happy, if you contribute something good to society, then when the time comes to go, you will have left the world a better place than what it was when you came into it. So I don't think life is meaningless. I think life is beautiful. I think life is meaningful if you can help others, serve others, create something of value that others can benefit from. If you do that, you will live a meaningful life, and when the time comes, you'll say, okay, time's up, move on. So that's what I would say. I would say, be cheerful, be positive, and find your purpose in life. Find what makes you truly happy, not momentary pleasure. Momentary pleasure can be acquired through drugs, through alcohol, and whatnot. But once that temporary high goes away, you will feel worse than when you started off. What you seek is what makes you happy gradually, and over time the happiness increases, not temporary ups and downs. That is not happiness. That is just mere chemical pleasure. It's hitting the dopamine center of your brain. That's not what you want. You want something that really makes you happy in the long run, and constant happiness. So that's what you need to discover for yourself. Everybody is different. What makes each individual happy is different. But if you can discover what that is, if you can find what fulfills you and what makes you truly happy in the long run, you will have found the purpose of your life. And then your life will be spent doing something meaningful and good. That is what I can say, my dear friends. So, Dongar Singh Chauhan, I hope you do that. And please be positive. Please be optimistic. Life can be great. Life is good, and life is great. You just have to find your own path in it. All right, my friends, it's almost 2 hours now. Thank you very much for all the questions. Very interesting questions. I could only take a few. So let's keep doing this. And I look forward to many more sessions like this with you all. Thank you very much. And I will see you very soon again. Bye.